Good evening, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to the main library. Welcome back to those of you who have been attending our Americans in the Holocaust programming lineup. This is the last one, so thank you for coming out. If you have not had a chance yet to explore the exhibit up on the second floor, it will be here through October 15th. It is a really nice exhibit. It is here on loan from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. This is a partnership with the American Library Association. It will be touring the country over the next 2 years and going to 50 different libraries, and we were first. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our very own Dr. Nic Butler, who I think many of you already know.
I, as the resident historian here at the Charleston County Public Library, I was asked to contribute something. And the first thing that came to my mind was, okay, the local scene during the 1930s and 1940s, during World War II, and during that period leading up to and during the midst of the Holocaust, what did people in Charleston know? As a local historian, that's my focus. What did people know? Newspapers seemed to be a logical way for me to try to come up with an answer of what did people in Charleston know? People who maybe didn't have any family in Europe and had no means of acquiring any firsthand knowledge. What could they have known during those war years about the atrocities that were going on? And so that was the impetus for the title I came up with for tonight's program. And I want to tell you a little bit about my methodology. So here's what I did. Because 20th century history is not necessarily my strong suit. So I thought, okay, I need to educate myself before I can, get up to speed to carry on a conversation with an audience about this. And so the first thing I did was try to identify key events in the chronology. So today, the easiest way to do that is go to the public library or go to the internet. And I am very pleased to say that the website of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. is an excellent source of accurate information and deep information. So you're looking at one small page. It's actually a timeline of key dates in the Holocaust. So I really relied a lot on this very helpful resource, and it pointed me to lots of documents and lots of events, and I was able to take that information and then go beyond that website and look at books and magazines and newspapers and try to put that into a local context. And so I'm very pleased to say that the outline of my program kind of follows the outline of the exhibit that you'll see upstairs. And so if you've already toured the exhibit upstairs, then you'll recognize some of the points that I'm going to be making in tonight's program. And if you haven't seen the exhibit, well, there's still a couple more weeks to see that. So also, the second thing that I did was to peruse the Charleston newspapers of the 1930s and 1940s. And that is something that is incredibly easy to do and doesn't cost you anything today because of news services that you can find through the website of the Charleston County Public Library. So bear with me for just a minute. I want to give you a quick tour on the Charleston County's Public Library website, ccpl.org. If you go to that website, if you've never used the newspapers before, let me just give you a quick indication of how you can do that, because this is something I do every single day. I'm using historical newspapers for all kinds of topic research every single day, and that would cost me a lot of money, except the library has a subscription to this. And if you have a library card, you can use this resource for free. So you go to the Charleston County Public Library website. Up at the very top in that red oval, you see the word research. Click on the word research. It'll take you to this page of all kinds of databases, audio things, magazines, all kinds of learning, educational modules. And down in the right left-hand corner, you'll see something for world news, historical, and current. And you click on that, it takes you to this page. Access that, and you'll see this line of script in blue. All you have to do is click on that link, and it'll ask you to put in your library card number, which is D and then a string of numbers, and then you make up a 4-digit PIN. You don't have to remember it. You just make up a different one every time you use it. And it takes you right in to millions of pages of digitized newspapers. So in this database, you will find New York newspapers, Chicago newspapers, Philadelphia newspapers, Atlanta newspapers, and almost, not quite everyone, but almost every newspaper printed in Charleston since 1783. Digitized, keyword searchable. You can find information about your families or your favorite sport team or any other topic that you might want to find. This is amazing technology that has emerged over the past 25 years. So before, 25 years ago, you had to sit with the newspapers on microfilm and scroll through, and I spent a lot of time doing that upstairs. But now this resource is so convenient, so you can search to your heart's content. And one of the things that I learned in doing this, and you'll notice from the images that I'm going to show you in just a moment, Charleston relied on syndicated news. So none of the Charleston newspapers had a man or woman in Berlin or in Paris. There's no exclusive correspondent for the Charleston Press. Charleston is relying on the Associated Press and the United Press for all of the stories that came in, well, almost all of the stories that came in during the 1930s and the 1940s. So there were some other stories provided by other news agencies, but the point is there are no local news reporters giving exclusive coverage. So the news that Charlestonians read was the same news that Chicagoans read and, Los Angelites read. It's the same news across the country. So let's begin a chronology of the important dates, or a selection of important dates in the chronology of the Holocaust. And let's look and see what people in Charleston were reading about. So, for example, on the 30th of January was the day that Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. So the Nazi Party, National Socialist Party, had been around since the early 1920s and had been causing a lot of trouble in Germany, as we all know. But as of the 30th of January 1933, the Nazi Party is part of the government apparatus. It's the dominant party, but it's not the only party in 1933. But starting in 1933, Nazi policies, which included anti-Semitism as part of its agenda, became part of the official government policy of Germany. And that was reported here in Charleston because everybody here knew what that meant. So from 1933 to 1945 are just hundreds and hundreds of reports of an ongoing campaign of violence against minorities that the Nazi Party deemed unfit to be German citizens. And that animosity fell principally on people of the Jewish faith, but not exclusively. And that was reported copiously. So just here, for example, this is the News and Courier, the predecessor to the Charleston Post and Courier. It changed its name in 1991, by the way. So the News and Courier here reporting on Sunday morning, the 5th of July. This is just, 1 week after Hitler has become chancellor. And there is a long story about people in Germany seeing Hitler's rise as the climax of the decade of strife. And in that news report, it's saying that Hitler is probably going to make good on the promise that he's been repeating for years, that he's going to rid Germany of Jewish people. This was something that as early as 1933, people saw that was on the cards. It was something that could very well happen. And here's another report. Just a few weeks later, this is March of 1933, some local golf champions. But on that same page are news reports coming out of Paris where there are already Jewish refugees fleeing with their belongings out of Germany and pouring into France. And they're describing this panic, which started as a rivulet just after Hitler's appointment to the chancellorship on January 30th. A few hundred, later thousands, who knew their names to be on Hitler's blacklist and recalled his threat that, quote, heads will roll in the sand, and began exiting Germany. And over here is a New York story about people in New York having a fast on Monday next, the beginning of April, as a protest against the Nazi discrimination against the Jewish people. Already red flags are going up and people are panicking and people are leaving. So the people of Charleston at the very least knew that this was a dangerous situation that was liable to get worse. And just a few days later, this is the 26th of March, 1933. So just 2 months after Hitler has become Chancellor of Germany. And there's a story about Rabbi Axelman of Brith Shalom here in Charleston. And this is not Rabbi Axelman. This here, in case you're interested, this is Mr. Condon, the founder of Condon's department store. And so he's just got his picture on the paper. But here's the story that we're interested in. And so there was a prayer meeting organized by Rabbi Axelman to pray for the German people. And there's a quote from him, and I know this is hard to read, but I'll read it to you. It's a little fuzzy here. Rabbi Axelman says, he's talking about German Jews who don't want to leave Germany because they love Germany. He says they are as grateful and as loyal to and as proud of their country as it is and ought to be of them. Although the recent atrocities committed against the Jews in Germany are so unbelievably barbaric in an age of understanding such as this, they have been attested to by such authentic reporters that they cannot be denied. Yet the German citizens of the Jewish faith try to minimize them as far as possible, urged on by a genuine sense of loyalty and a deep feeling and love for the country in which they live. So there was some reluctance. People here in Charleston knew there was some reluctance for those Jewish people in Germany who had a chance to leave, but perhaps didn't want to leave because it was their country. In the summer of 1933, Charlestonians read the earliest reports of what became known as concentration camps. Now, by the way, that term concentration camp shows up in Charleston news long before this. There were camps where soldiers would congregate before being shipped out to one place or another. So the term concentration camp had a military sense in the U.S. military and in South Carolina years before this, but concentration camp took on a new meaning for Americans in the summer of 1933. So the concentration camps set up by the Nazi Party to, quote-unquote, re-educate their political enemies began cropping up as early as March 1933. The first news I found of that in the Charleston press was in the summer of 1933. So here's an example. This is from the Charleston Evening Post, the 31st of July, 1933. And it's a story about permanent institutions, educational concentration camps of Nazi Germany, and saying that they're springing up all over the place, and they may soon become permanent institutions designed to crush in the bud any opposition and teach the misguided the only true national religion. And right there, this is evident in Dachau, the first of the concentration camps. Bavaria's big concentration camp, where considerable construction is going on. That is to convert the camp from a revolutionary makeshift to an established Nazi college. So there are no reports of mass killings. There are no reports of mass torture because that has not started on a systematic scale yet. This is a place where people were certainly abused physically and mentally, but it's a place that the American people were just learning to identify as something that's new and part of the Nazi agenda. Here's another story in the News and Courier from a few months later, October of 1933. And there is news coming to Washington, and this is reproduced from Washington, about the fact that for non-Aryan people in Germany, life is, quote, uncertain and precarious. And that's something that is only going to get worse. Down here at the bottom, many reports that Jews as well as Marxists or communists are confined in concentration camps and held incommunicado on indeterminate charges for indefinite periods of time. So it's a place that is growing in the American consciousness. And over the next several years are numerous reports in the American press of activities at these concentration camps, and as well as some of the names of the many camps that are springing up throughout Germany. Skipping ahead a little bit to 1935, another significant moment. On the 15th of September at Nuremberg, the Nazi government, under the direction of Adolf Hitler, passed several laws that became known as the Nuremberg race laws that effectively revoked the citizenship of millions of German Jews. And this is something that made it difficult for people to get out of the country in later years because they were no longer citizens and they had to get different kinds of papers. And so here's a newspaper report from the Charleston Evening Post just a few days later of that Nuremberg Reichstag meeting. This was not a rally, it was a special meeting in the Nuremberg Town Hall for the ratification of these new laws to celebrate the advance of the Nazi regime. And this is the caption. I know you can't read this tiny little caption down here, but it's stating very explicitly for the reading public here in Charleston that Hitler says, "We are now making history." And he summed up the program at the annual Congress of the Nazi Party, during which they deprived Jews of citizenship and set up the swastika banner as the official flag of the German Reich. And all other political parties have been effectively crushed. The Nazi Party is Germany's government at this point. There is no alternative within Germany. In March of 1936, Germany reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland, and that was formerly part of Germany but taken away by the Treaty of Versailles in 1918 at the conclusion of World War I, a demilitarized zone to punish Germany for its atrocities during World War I. So to thumb their nose at European peace treaties, they reoccupied the Rhineland, which was a very provocative step that was really just the first step towards war. And then in 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria, the Anschluss. They're incorporating Austria into Hitler's concept of the fatherland, the idea that Germany needs to reassert its presence on the German map, on the European map, and expand outward and grab colonial territory as well. So in the aftermath of that, here's a newspaper report from June 18th, 1938. So we've got some volcano news. But way over here on the left column is a story about increasing violence on the streets of Berlin. So not part of a government program, but part of individual citizens filled with Nazi dogma and hate against the Jewish population are harassing Jewish shop owners and Jewish citizens and causing havoc on the streets. And as the newspaper report says, daubing anti-Jewish slogans on storefronts to identify the stores and the businesses as Jewish-owned places. And lots of vandalism going on, but again, not a government program, but it's just increasing violence and increasing frustration in Berlin specifically. And that just kept increasing throughout the year. And so many reports were coming out during the summer and autumn of 1938. So many reports coming out of Germany of Jews being harassed and victimized that the Nazi government actually released press statements to the American press saying this is all overblown. These stories are all exaggerated. Nobody is harassing the Jewish people. The Jewish people are fine and they're happy. And so some members of the American press kind of repeated that propaganda to the American public. And so there are people in America who are kind of undermining the Jewish cause by believing the Nazi government at face value. What they were saying was absolute lie, but it's part of their propaganda machine. And in this news report from the Associated Press, they're saying it seems like there's an anti-Semitic drive which seems aimed at cleansing Berlin of 140,000 Jews. So the idea of cleansing, which they are putting in quotation marks in 1938, is already in the vocabulary of what would become the Holocaust. So here's part of that same story a little bit farther down. I wanted to put this nice big so you could see it. Julius Streicher, who was tried at Nuremberg after the war and hanged, ran a newspaper called Der Stürmer. And he was the most vocal advocate at that time, saying what the German government would not commit to writing at the time. But the belief, quote, that the extermination of the Jews would be the only solution of the Jewish problem. So that's in the Charleston press, in the United States press in 1938. And Julius Streicher was a well-known mouthpiece, not an official member of the government, but he and his privately published newspaper were very influential at the time. In October 1938, Nazi Germany annexed the Sudetenland. So part of Czechoslovakia, again, part of the land that was taken away from Germany during World War I, or at the conclusion of World War I, and they are re-annexing that property. And immediately thereafter, in coordination with some other things that the Polish government was doing, the Nazi government started deporting tens of thousands of Polish Jews out of Germany. So Polish nationalists who were Jews within German borders are being exported en masse out of the country, starting at the beginning of October and continuing after that. Mass chaos going on. And it caused a great deal of disturbance. So here in Charleston, as elsewhere in the United States, in October of 1938, people knew this was going on. They didn't know all the details, but they knew the bigger picture. And that led just a few weeks later to Kristallnacht, the night of violence in Berlin, the 9th and 10th of November 1938. And Kristallnacht, not using that name, of course, but that night of violence was widely reported in the United States and here in Charleston as well, as you see on the News and Courier. And thanks to these telegraphic reports, transatlantic telegraphic reports, we're getting this news here in Charleston just literally a day after the events are going on. So it's frenzied Nazi terrorists flout government orders and continued destruction, because the Nazi government, very smooth operators when it came to propaganda, said, we have told people to stop rioting and leave the nice Jewish people alone. But in fact, the Nazi government was fomenting the terrorism, and there were shops looted, thousands of people were kidnapped, taken away. There was a great deal of violence and death, totally underreported at the time. These news reports in the hours and days after Kristallnacht indicate that, maybe a couple of people died and maybe a couple of people got injured. But it was nothing like the true scale of the event. And here's another report. This is when you saw earlier when you came in. Poor Pearl Buck, who won a Nobel Prize, novelist Pearl Buck, has her picture right next to the headline about the violence that's going on in Berlin and throughout Germany at that time. So again, the government is saying, well, we told these people to stop rioting, but they, that's private citizens expressing their point of view. But the Nazi government is actually, as we all know, was fomenting that anti-Jewish vandalism and really just the people trying to purge Berlin and other cities of their Jewish populations. Skipping ahead to the 30th of January, 1939. So, to mark the 6th anniversary of his rise to the chancellorship in Germany, Hitler said, "I'm going to give a big speech." And everybody in Germany knew it was going to be a big speech. And everyone in the United States knew that it was going to be a big speech that was kept very secret. But in the days leading up to that speech, there were people talking about, well, just kind of trying to guess, what is Hitler going to announce? Is he going to announce the beginning of a new war or annexing some more territory or some new political policies? Everyone was waiting to hear what he would say. How is Europe going to fare in the coming days? And, of course, Hitler gave one of his typical speeches where he's ranting about a variety of topics. But he stopped short of threatening war. In fact, he said, the German people are peaceful people, and we don't want war. We just want what is ours. We want our territory. And if we get our territory, there's no need for war. And that message created two different reactions in the Western world. So on the right side of the screen, you see the British reaction. So Prime Minister Chamberlain of Britain said, well, see, that was a very peaceful speech. And so my policy of appeasement of Hitler has succeeded because Hitler said he's not going to go to war. But over on the left-hand side of the screen, we see that President Roosevelt here in the United States had a meeting with the Senate Arms Committee to talk about how many tanks do we have, how many planes do we have, how many can we afford to send to France and Britain, because he saw the handwriting on the wall, a very different kind of interpretation on that. And if you look at the text of the speech, which was translated and printed, not in its entirety, but large chunks of it were translated and printed in local newspapers, national newspapers and magazines, you can see a much starker picture. So look at this quote over here. There's a English language translation of part of Hitler's speech from January 1939. The Jewish question, Hitler continued, should be solved, and the sooner the better, for Europe cannot settle down until the Jewish question is cleared up. Should international Jewish financiers, and by that he means international Jewish financiers whom he thinks are running the United States, he's convinced that there's the cabal of Jewish merchants who run the United States. If those international Jewish financiers succeed in plunging the nations, meaning Germany, England, France, the United States, into a world war, then the result would not be the Bolshevization or the communization of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Right there in the newspapers in 1939, Hitler's stating what he's going to do. So many people did not believe him, but in hindsight, that was such a prophetic kind of moment. March 1939, German forces occupied Czechoslovakia. On the 1st of September, German forces invaded Poland, which, as we now know, is the very beginning of World War II. But people didn't look at it quite like that. So in the news reporting immediately after those stormtroopers moved into Poland on the 1st of September, people were saying, well, maybe there'll be war, maybe they won't. We're going to warn Hitler one more time. So France and Great Britain are warning him, and meanwhile, the Third Reich is claiming victory and storming across Poland. And it's the beginning of a new war. And as the exhibit from the museum upstairs shows, Americans were debating about whether or not we as United States citizens are going to be dragged into this war. And that was something that was under debate for a couple of more years. So very soon after the beginning of the new year, 1940, it's the opening of the first camp at Auschwitz. So there ended up later being satellite camps at Auschwitz. There's Auschwitz 1, 2, and 3. This is Auschwitz number 1, which was not necessarily created as a quote-unquote extermination camp. It evolved into that later, but it begins in 1941. Was it reported in the local press? No. We know that there are camps going on, but the word Auschwitz I cannot find in the newspapers of Charleston until 1945. So the 27th of September, 1940, I just wanted to put this in a context because I always wondered about this too. Well, how did Nazi Germany, shake hands with Japan? And they had Italy and Japan and Germany had a political agreement and alliance before this time, but in 1940 they signed a military pact. So now there's an axis of military powers, not just political and trade partners, but they are a military pact. They will be acting in concert in the coming year. On the 22nd of June, 1941, German forces invaded the Soviet Union, which turned out to be a big disaster for them and the Russian people, but it was widely reported here, step by step. Not necessarily the atrocities, that's kind of the sidelight of the major stories that are being reported through the syndicated press across the United States. The focus, the newspaper reporting is almost exclusively on the military campaign and not on the civilian toll in that. But if you look in the newspapers in a little bit more detail, and that's what's wonderful about being able to do keyword searching through the newspapers without having to read every word that's printed on every page. I found this small article on the 26th of September, 1941, kind of a back page, and ironically put next to a quilting pattern is a story about the gold stars. In September 1941 is when the German government mandated that Jewish people must wear a gold Star of David or yellow Star of David on their left breast at all times. And so that fact, that edict from the German government wasn't itself reported in the newspaper. But here's this story that says people in Germany believe that Americans require German nationals to wear an identification marking them as German people in America. And that misinformation is somewhat responsible, they say in 1941, for the fact that as of September 19th, throughout Berlin and beyond, Jews must wear the yellow star because America compels our Germans over there in the United States to wear a swastika, which is not true. So Americans are denying that story in Germany. I just found this because I was wondering, what about the gold star or the yellow badge or the yellow star? And this was the only story that I could find. On the 7th of December, 1941, Japan's Army and Navy attacked Pearl Harbor. And just a few days later, conveniently, Hitler declared war on the United States. So the United States didn't have to declare war on Germany. Germany did it for us. The important fact of that is that just a couple of days later, the United States government passed a resolution to create the Office of Censorship. And from this moment on, what Charlestonians are reading about the atrocities that we now call the Holocaust were filtered through the United States Office of Censorship that restricted a lot of information about wartime activities. Not just the movements of armies and tanks and planes, but also of atrocities committed against civilian populations throughout Eastern Europe. So between 1942 and 1944, as you can see in the exhibit upstairs, this is really the climax of the Holocaust, the climax of the final solution of exterminating. And that term exterminating appears numerous times in the American press, exterminating the Jewish population of Europe. So there is a surge of executions of all kinds, and it's really going on in occupied areas of the Soviet Union and German occupied areas in Poland and Eastern Europe. And some of it's taking place within the borders of Germany, but most of it is farther east. And that's an area where the Soviet army is battling on the Eastern Front with the Nazis. So American soldiers at this point that are entering the European war have limited contact with Eastern Europe. So the American press, American journalists are not getting firsthand reports of atrocities in Eastern Europe. They are getting reports from their allies in Eastern Europe and through the Soviet Union. So also in 1942, on the 17th of December 1942, the United Nations, which is a name that was just made up by President Roosevelt at the time to describe all the nations allied with the United States, including Great Britain, France, and Belgium, and all those other Western European nations. They made a joint declaration. So all of those reports that are coming from the allies in Eastern Europe about atrocities that are being filtered and kept from the eyes of the American public are being digested by members of the American government who are horrified by what they're learning about. So they made a joint declaration in 1942. And it's reported right here in the newspaper the day after that report came out in Washington that there is a joint report condemning Nazi policy. And it's describing, quote, the bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination of the Jews. This is really the beginning of an avalanche of information about atrocities that comes out in the next couple of years. And so this joint declaration that was made in December 1942 is only about 300 words long. And the entire text of it was reported in newspapers across the United States, including Charleston. So if you look at the rest of this paper, the entire text of that joint declaration is printed. And you can find this joint declaration on the internet so easily. And this is not all of it, this is most of it. But the United States government is not going to give you all the details, but the United States government is telling you, citizens of the United States, that we have good information that German authorities, not content with denying to persons of the Jewish race their citizenship, they are now carrying into effect Hitler's oft-repeated intention to exterminate the Jewish people in Europe. And Poland has been made into the principal Nazi slaughterhouse. So millions of people are being deliberately massacred. Actually, it doesn't say millions. It says hundreds of thousands of entirely innocent men, women, and children. So they're not giving us, the American people, the details, but they are telling us there's some bad stuff going on and more information to be divulged as the war matures. On the 30th of August, 1943, there's another joint declaration, but this is now just the United States and Great Britain. Another brief joint declaration specifying retributions. So not reporting atrocities, but promising the world that there will be consequences for the atrocities that are taking place. So German crimes against Poland hotly denounced. So they are reaffirming their resolve to punish the German instigators of this crime. And that these atrocities that continue to be committed must be taken into account against the time of the final settlement with Germany. And so they're not providing all the details, that's all classified, but they say trustworthy information has reached the United States government regarding crimes that are taking place against the population of Poland and other Eastern European nations. And if you read the rest of the story, it's hinting at extermination camps that have been discovered in Poland and Hungary and places like that. They are hinting at it. But again, this is not first-hand information that United States journalists have. This is information that's coming to the United States from their allies in occupied territory. On the 22nd of January, 1944, because there's so much anger about these atrocities that are taking place, within the United States government, and government officials are required to keep their mouths shut about it, the Department of the Treasury convinced President Roosevelt to create the United States War Refugee Board. It was just inspired by all these reports. We have to do something. Something has to be done. So the government authorized this board to be created, and they set about trying to devise ways to get Jewish people out of Europe, if possible. And of course, not very much came of this, but the most memorable aspect of it, and I'm interrupting myself now. Here's the news report that appears on page 2 of the News and Courier in January 1944. And it says, the executive order setting this up instructs the board to take all measures within its power to rescue the victims of enemy oppression who are in imminent danger of death and otherwise, to afford such victims all possible relief and assistance consistent with the successful prosecution of the war. So we have to fight the war, but along the way, if we can rescue some people, that would be nice as well. And of course, the most successful aspect of this, Raoul Wallenberg, who went into Hungary and managed to rescue some thousands of people. There is some debate about how many thousands of people exactly. But even if you don't recognize his face, you might recognize the name, because here in Charleston, west of the Ashley River, we have a boulevard named after Raoul Wallenberg, not a Charlestonian, never came to Charleston, but he's an important figure in the story of the Holocaust and the United States' effort to rescue some people. He was Swedish, I believe. Danish, okay, he was Danish. He was a businessman, he was a lawyer, he was not a diplomat, he was not a soldier, but he volunteered to undertake this desperate task, which ultimately cost him his life. He disappeared in 1945. Nobody knows exactly what happened to him. On the 6th of June, 1944, of course, we all know about D-Day and the invasion of Normandy. And in the months after that, reporting started to change. And here's kind of the tip of the iceberg. I thought this was kind of interesting. President Roosevelt, on the 12th of June, 1944, so just 6 days after D-Day, he's giving an address to the United States Congress. And he's talking about how the Nazi army is all but defeated. We are now in the final big push of the war. And during that final push, the Nazis are going to continue the fury of their insane desire to wipe out the Jewish race in Europe. So that is something that the president obviously knows more than he is able to tell the American public. He has heard the inside details, but he is perhaps laying the groundwork for upcoming reports that will be in the news. So, for example, on the 3rd of July, 1944, Charlestonians read this dispatch from New York that got a report by way of Geneva that there are mass extermination camps at Auschwitz and Birkenau. And over the past 2 years, more than 1,700,000 people have been murdered at Auschwitz and Birkenau alone. Now, that figure might be kind of high, but that is a wartime estimate. That's the first news that Americans are hearing about the scale of the atrocities that are going on. And, of course, just a few weeks later, the liberation of the camp at Lublin in Poland. And this was the first of the quote-unquote death camps or extermination camps. Its sole purpose was to execute people and dispose of their bodies. This is one of several Nazi camps that had that sole purpose as an extermination camp or death camp. It was liberated by Russian forces in late summer, captured almost entirely intact. So there was no denying about what was going on. And reports about what was found at that camp started appearing in the newspapers. Like, here's a story just a few days later in the Charleston Evening Post about thousands of civilians wailing outside of this camp and watching German captives dig up the bodies of victims while the army is watching this. And, civilians are screaming at the German soldiers who are uncovering bodies. This is really the first details that Americans are learning about this. So these reports of atrocities that are coming out of Poland and Eastern Europe are starting to filter into the United States press in the second half of 1944, which led the War Refugee Board to publish a report on the 25th of November. And some modern historians call this the Auschwitz Protocols, because there were spies who collected information from Auschwitz and Birkenau and another camp, detailed information, drawings, plans, detailed descriptions of the death protocol, the extermination protocol being practiced by the Nazi army, and secreted that information out, and the United States government published it for the world to see, and you can find it entirely online today. The proper title is The German Extermination Camps of Auschwitz and Birkenau. 25,000 words of undisputable evidence from first-hand eyewitnesses describing how mass extermination is taking place, where it is taking place, how it is done, how many people are involved. So the scale and the systematic nature of it is exposed to the world. This was really shocking information at the time. And this is a newspaper report from the local News and Courier about that report. So 25,000 word report. The whole thing is not discussed, but it is summarized. And there are choice quotes in the Charleston newspapers taken from this report that are just amazing. For example, it is a fact beyond denial that the Germans have deliberately and systematically murdered millions of innocent civilians, Jews and Christians alike, all over Europe. So this is information that is really shocking to the American people. They don't have all the details yet, but they are really discovering the scale of the atrocities that are going on. So you and I now know, in retrospect, that Auschwitz-Birkenau camps were liberated by the Russian army on the 27th of January, 1945. So I went right to the newspapers to try to find reports about that, and perhaps some jubilation of the people who were rescued or saved, or perhaps some words of horror in the newspaper about the masses of bodies they found. But there's absolutely no press coverage of this for months and months and months, not until after the end of the war. We are in the final phase of the war, so the government has clamped down on information. So between January, February, March, April of 1945, the Russian army, the United States, and the Allied armies are liberating all of those concentration camps and the extermination camps in Eastern Europe. And American GIs and Russian soldiers are witnessing firsthand. General Patton, General Eisenhower are seeing firsthand the atrocities. But this information is being kept from the American people until it is a conclusion that the Allies will win the war. So, for example, here's a report from the 23rd of April, 1945, which was a significant day in I think it was the last of the extermination camps was liberated. And here's a report with a photograph on the front page of this Evening Post edition showing the chief of the quote-unquote death camp. So that term death camp and extermination camp becomes part of the common vocabulary of journalism starting in the summer of 1944. And for the last year of the war, Americans know that there are such things as death camps. And so that's just one example of it. Now, if you had this paper in your hand and you turned it over to look below the fold, you would see this report in the Evening Post. Nazi atrocities promise to become weapon in Allied winning of peace. And I think this is a significant article here. It's saying, this is straight out of Washington now, that Incredible Nazi atrocities on political and military prisoners today promise to become one of the sharpest weapons in the hands of the Allied leaders in winning the peace. This is the belief held widely by observers in Washington who have sought to understand why, after maintaining strict censorship over atrocity stories out of the war theaters, authorities have now released them in a sudden flood. So beginning in late April and continuing onward, there is a flood of detailed information about atrocities in Eastern Europe. And so this article is trying to explain why that is happening now. So many of these atrocities had been known about by insiders before, and many correspondents had been irked by restrictions against them. The defense of the policy rested on the danger that new atrocities might be encouraged if those of the past were widely publicized. So American GIs, British soldiers, French soldiers, Russian soldiers are getting so close to decimating the Nazi army, we can't risk, infuriating them any more than they already are. While numerous atrocity stories were publicized during the last war, that is, World War I, they were generally accepted as part of the propaganda by the Allies, and Germany later resented those stories. So in the present war, those stories about atrocities were kept at a minimum, partly for fear that they would again be resented, and partly because they might break down observance of the laws of war generally. Deterioration of this war fabric, it was argued, would work against Allied prisoners still held in Germany. So that's the United States government's explanation of why they have been suppressing information about atrocities until this moment, when it looks like the Allies are going to win the war any day now. And of course, they did. Just 2 weeks later, Germany surrendered unconditionally, which was reported here on the 8th of May on the front page of the News and Courier. Down here is a little story about local reaction. Reporters on the beat in Charleston asking people, "The war's over. Did you hear the war's over? What do you think?" And most people responding to journalist questions said, "Nope, I don't believe it. I'll believe it when I see it in the newspapers and I hear the generals and the president say it, but I don't believe it." The war had been so long and so bloody and so horrifying that it took a while for people to accept that the end had finally come. So in this tour of newspapers printed in Charleston, we've learned something about the local scene during the Holocaust, during World War II, but can we quantify what we learned? Well, I think what I learned from this is that Charlestonians were reading the same syndicated news that their relatives and family and friends in other American cities and other American states were learning about. There was nothing in the reporting here in Charleston that was unique. So yes, there might have been people, members of the Jewish community here in Charleston, who had family in Europe who were sending them letters, and there was a program last week talking about exactly that. But none of that made it to the newspapers. There aren't any unique insights in the local newspapers, but Charlestonians read enough. The newspapers included numerous reports before the war even started about anti-Semitic violence in Germany and Eastern Europe, from the beginning of the rise of Adolf Hitler to the very end of the war. There was copious reporting about animosity in Eastern Europe. But during the worst part of the war, during the worst part of the Holocaust, 1942, 43, 44, very sparse reporting of atrocities in the newspaper. There are reports coming out of Eastern Europe through diplomatic channels and making its way to the syndicated news across the United States, but not so much in terms of detail. And it took a while for the scope and the scale to become obvious. But then, starting in the summer of 1944, with the liberation of the first extermination camp at Lublin in Poland, there were more and more reports of atrocities and official government reports and acknowledgments of the scale of the atrocities. And during the final weeks of the war, not months, but the final weeks of the war, when the bulk of the fighting was done, reports of atrocities increased dramatically, and more details are coming to the U.S. press because there are U.S. soldiers who are there in person seeing and witnessing this with their own eyes and reporting back to their friends and family. So at this point, it was impossible for the United States government to censor that information anymore. So we've just spent an hour talking about a very depressing, very difficult topic, but it's something that our community learned about through the vehicle of newspaper journalism primarily back in that period 80 years ago. And many of the lessons that we learned at that time are lessons that we keep learning, and we keep repeating this information. And that's really the purpose of the exhibit that we have upstairs, to make sure that these lessons and the atrocities that we learned about during World War II, we never forget those. We never forget the scale of man's inhumanity to man and the need to combat that rhetoric that started small in the 1920s and dramatically increased in the 1930s and then really became a weapon of destruction in the 1940s. And keeping that memory alive and making sure that the world never forgets is part of the mission of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And so I would like to thank the museum as a local historian, as a library employee, for making my job easier and for letting this library, Charleston County Public Library, host this exhibit that we have upstairs, and the American Library Association for helping to promote this across public libraries around the United States during this year. And I'd like to thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you very much.